The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of David Ford's penthouse office, each droplet racing down the glass like silver bullets in the darkness. He stood with his back to the room, a silhouette of controlled power against the storm-battered Chicago skyline. The city sprawled beneath him, his city, though fewer people knew that truth than believed it. "Boss, we have a problem." David didn't turn at Mark Webster's voice. His second-in-command had entered without knocking, which meant the situation warranted the breach of protocol. In the reflection of the window, David watched Mark approach, noting the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he moved. After 15 years in this business, David could read body language like scripture. "Define problem," David said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made grown men reconsider their life choices. Mark stopped a respectful distance away. "Your sister called about the wedding." Now David turned, his dark eyes finding Mark's face with laser precision. At 34, David Ford had inherited an empire built on blood and bullets, but he'd transformed it into something more sophisticated, though no less dangerous. His tailored Armani suit couldn't hide the predator beneath, the kind of man who'd risen to power not through birthright alone, but through calculated ruthlessness and an intelligence that his enemies consistently underestimated. "What about the wedding?" David's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His cousin Angela's wedding was in 3 days, a massive affair that would bring together 5 of the most powerful families on the East Coast. It was meant to be a celebration, but in their world, such gatherings were chess matches played with champagne flutes and hidden weapons. "Angela's making noise about your situation." Mark chose his words carefully. "She says if you show up alone again, it sends the wrong message, makes the family look weak. She's threatening to seat you at the singles table with her college friends." David's expression darkened. It wasn't about the seating arrangement, it was about perception. In their world, a man without a woman by his side at 34 raised questions. Questions about stability, questions about vulnerability, questions that invited challenges from rival families who might see an unattached boss as an easier target. "And my mother?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "She agrees with Angela, says it's time you brought someone respectable. Her words, not mine." David moved to his desk, a massive piece of mahogany that had belonged to his father. He'd been dodging this conversation for months, deflecting his family's increasingly insistent attempts to set him up with daughters of allied families. Each potential match came with strings, alliances to be forged, debts to be paid, freedoms to be surrendered. "Tell them I'll handle it," David said. Mark hesitated. "Boss, there's more. Edwin Pointer will be there." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Edwin Pointer represented the Peterson family's interests in Chicago, and rumors suggested he'd been testing David's borders, probing for weaknesses. A wedding would put them in the same room for an entire weekend, surrounded by potential allies and enemies alike. "All the more reason to appear stable," David muttered, dismissing Mark with a gesture. Alone again, David stared at the invitation on his desk, elegant cream cardstock with gold embossing, the kind of ostentatious display his family loved. 3 days. He needed a date who could navigate his world without being consumed by it, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions or expect too much, someone disposable. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of humor. 20 blocks away, Janet Ruiz stood in the rain outside Millennium Park, her entire body shaking, though not from the cold. The envelope in her hand was already soaked through, but she could still make out the eviction notice through the plastic window. 3 months behind on rent. 3 months of choosing between keeping the lights on and keeping her diabetic mother's insulin prescription filled. She just lost her job at the accounting firm. Restructuring, they'd called it, though Janet knew it had more to do with her refusing her supervisor's advances than any economic concerns. Timothy Jerusai, the senior partner's son, hadn't taken rejection well. Now she was standing in the rain with nowhere to go and no one to call. The coffee shop across the street beckoned with warm light and the promise of shelter. Janet crossed against the light, too exhausted to wait for the walk signal. The screech of tires came too late. The town car stopped inches from her legs, its bumper kissing her knees just hard enough to send her sprawling onto the wet asphalt. The eviction notice flew from her hand, skittering across the pavement like an escaped secret. What the hell? The driver's door opened, and John Peterson, though Janet didn't know his name, emerged looking furious. You trying to get yourself killed, lady? But it was the rear door that drew her attention. It opened smoothly, and a man stepped out, the kind of man who didn't belong on rain-soaked streets. His suit probably cost more than her monthly rent, his shoes gleaming despite the weather. But it was his eyes that held her, dark, assessing, and curiously intense as they took in her sodden appearance. David Ford hadn't planned to leave the office, but Mark's news had left him restless. He'd ordered John to drive while he thought, and now found himself standing in the rain, staring at a woman who looked like she'd already lost everything worth losing. Are you hurt? His voice cut through the rain and John's continued protests. Janet pushed herself up, wincing as her palms scraped against the pavement. I'm fine. I'm sorry I wasn't. She stopped, seeing the eviction notice floating in a puddle. The pink paper might as well have been a neon sign advertising her desperation. David followed her gaze, understanding flashing across his features. He bent, surprising both John and Janet, and retrieved the sodden document. His eyes scanned it quickly, noting the address, the amount owed, the signature at the bottom. Timothy Jerusai. David knew that name, knew the man's father ran a mid-level crew on the south side. Jerusai, he said quietly, and Janet's head snapped up. You know him. In a manner of speaking. David studied her more carefully now. Hispanic, late 20s, with the kind of stubborn pride in her bearing that suggested she didn't often accept help. Her clothes were professional but worn, the kind of careful presentation of someone trying to maintain dignity on a shoestring budget. He's why you lost your job. Janet's eyes widened. How could you possibly? Lucky guess. David glanced at John, who immediately understood the silent command and returned to the driver's seat. You need somewhere dry. Let me buy you a coffee. I don't need charity. It's not charity. An idea was forming in David's mind, crystallizing with the kind of clarity that had made him successful in business, both legitimate and otherwise. It's a business proposition, but I won't discuss it with you standing in the rain like a drowned cat. Against her better judgment, Janet found herself following him into the coffee shop. They must have made an odd pair, him in his perfect suit, her dripping rainwater onto the worn linoleum. David guided her to a corner booth, ordered 2 coffees without asking her preference, and then studied her with an intensity that should have been uncomfortable. What kind of business proposition? Janet asked, wrapping her hands around the hot mug gratefully. I need a date for a wedding. 3 days, including travel. In exchange, I'll clear your debt with your landlord and ensure Timothy Jerusai never bothers you again. Janet nearly choked on her coffee. Excuse me. It's a straightforward arrangement. You accompany me to a family wedding this weekend. You smile, you make conversation, you play the part of a devoted girlfriend. In return, your problems disappear. And what makes you think you can make my problems disappear? David smiled then, and Janet understood that whoever this man was, he was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with the gun John probably carried. Because Timothy Jerusai's father works for me. Or rather, his father's boss's boss works for me. A word in the right ear, and Timothy will be too busy explaining missing inventory in one of their warehouses to harass anyone. Who are you? David Ford. Janet's blood chilled. Everyone in Chicago knew that name, even if they'd never seen the face attached to it. The Ford family controlled half the city's underground, though they'd gone mostly legitimate in recent years, or so the newspapers claimed. She couldn't finish the sentence. I'm a businessman who needs a date to his cousin's wedding. Nothing more complicated than that. But it was complicated, and they both knew it. Janet stared at the eviction notice, still visible through the wet envelope he'd placed on the table between them. 3 months behind. Her mother's medication. No job prospects. No options. What would I have to do exactly? Attend pre-wedding events. The ceremony. The reception. Dance when required, smile when photographed, and convince my family that we're together. You'll have your own room, of course. I'm not asking for anything inappropriate. Why me? You could have anyone. Anyone would come with expectations, connections, complications. David leaned back, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. You're a clean slate. No ties to any family, no agenda beyond survival. That makes you perfect. And if I say no? Then you walk out of here and we never see each other again. You deal with your eviction and Timothy Jerusai on your own. He paused, letting the weight of that settle. But if you say yes, your problems end tonight. New apartment if you want it. Clean slate with Jerusai, all for 3 days of pretending. Janet thought about her mother, about the insulin that would run out in a week, about the shelter they'd end up in if she couldn't find work immediately. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. When do we leave? Something flickered in David's eyes, satisfaction perhaps or relief. Friday morning. I'll send someone to pick you up. Pack for a formal weekend. If you need clothes, that can be arranged. I can dress myself, thank you. I didn't mean. He stopped, and Janet saw a flash of something almost human beneath the controlled exterior. Of course, my apologies. He stood, pulling out a phone that probably cost more than her car had before she'd sold it. A brief conversation, too quiet for her to hear, and then he was sliding a business card across the table. My driver will take you home. This has my direct number. If Timothy Jerusai contacts you before Friday, call immediately. Why do you care what Timothy Jerusai does to me? David considered the question. I don't tolerate men who abuse their power over women. It's bad for business. It was more than that, Janet sensed, but she didn't push. She was already in too deep, agreeing to spend a weekend with Chicago's most dangerous bachelor. But as she watched him walk back to his car, reins sliding off his shoulders like the weight of the world he carried, she wondered if she just made a deal with the devil or found an unlikely savior. The town car pulled up outside her building 30 minutes later. Janet had expected to be dropped off, but David himself stepped out, surveying the rundown apartment complex with a critical eye. This is where you live. Not all of us have penthouses, Mr. Ford. David, he corrected. If we're going to convince my family we're together, you should probably use my first name. He followed her up 4 flights of stairs, past graffiti and broken lights, his presence incongruous in the dingy hallway. When she opened her apartment door, he stepped inside without invitation, taking in the sparse but meticulously clean space. You live alone. My mother's in the hospital, diabetic complications. Janet didn't know why she was telling him this. That's why I'm behind on rent, medical bills. David pulled out his phone again, typing quickly. She's at Northwestern Memorial. How did you? Never mind. Of course he knew. Men like him knew everything. She'll be transferred to a private room tonight. The bills will be handled. That's not necessary. It is if you're going to focus on this weekend. His tone brooked no argument. I need you sharp, not worried about your mother. Besides, my family will investigate you. Better if they find your mother comfortable than desperate. The casual way he rearranged her life should have terrified her. Instead, Janet felt an odd sense of relief. For the first time in months, someone else was handling the problems that had been drowning her. There's something else, David said, moving to her window. The view was of another building's brick wall, but he studied it as if it were the Chicago skyline. My world isn't safe. This weekend will put you in proximity to people who have done terrible things. Some of them will smile at you while calculating how to use you against me. Can you handle that? Do I have a choice? There's always a choice, but choices have consequences. He turned from the window, and in the dim light of her apartment, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. I won't let anyone hurt you, but you need to understand what you're walking into. A nest of vipers wearing Armani. His lips twitched, almost a smile. Something like that, though some prefer Versace. A knock at the door interrupted them. Janet opened it to find Mark Webster holding several shopping bags. Boss said you might need these, Mark said, his eyes taking in Janet with professional assessment. The bags contained clothes, designer pieces with the tags still on, all in her size. Cocktail dresses, evening gowns, shoes that probably cost more than her monthly salary had been. "How did you know my size?" Janet demanded. David had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "I'm good at details." "You mean you had someone research me in the last hour?" "That too." Mark cleared his throat. "Boss, we should go. The Pointers are expecting you at 9. David nodded, then turned back to Janet. "Friday morning, 8 sharp. Pack light. These clothes will cover the formal events. And Janet," he paused at her door, "whatever happens this weekend, whatever you see or hear, remember that it's temporary. 3 days and then you're free." But as Janet watched him disappear down her hallway, flanked by Mark like a shadow, she wondered if anyone was ever really free from David Ford's world once they'd entered it. The next 2 days passed in a blur. Her mother was indeed transferred to a private room, her doctors suddenly attentive and optimistic. The eviction notice was withdrawn. Janet's landlord called personally to apologize for the misunderstanding and offer a 6-month credit on her rent. Timothy Jerusai hadn't contacted her, but she'd heard through former coworkers that he'd been suddenly transferred to a position in Detroit. David Ford had erased her problems with the efficiency of a man, accustomed to making reality bend to his will. Thursday night, another knock brought Mark to her door. "Tomorrow's pickup is still at 8, he said, handing her a folder. "But the boss wanted you to have this." Inside was a detailed briefing on the wedding attendees, complete with photos and relationship diagrams that looked like something from a FBI investigation board. Angela Davis, the bride, David's cousin. Martha Blaker, David's mother, matriarch of the Ford empire since her husband's death 5 years ago. Edwin Pointer, underboss to the Peterson family, marked with a red star that suggested danger. "He expects me to memorize all this." "He expects you to survive the weekend," Mark said bluntly. "That means knowing who's friend, who's foe, and who's waiting to see which way the wind blows." "And which are you?" Mark studied her for a long moment. "I'm whoever the boss needs me to be, but for what it's worth, I think you might be good for him." "I'm just a temporary date." "Sure you are." Mark's expression suggested he knew something she didn't. 8 sharp, Miss Ruiz, don't be late." That night, Janet lay in bed studying the faces in the folder, trying to memorize names and connections. The Ford family tree was complex, full of marriages that were clearly alliances, deaths that were probably murders, and enough money to buy small countries. At the center of it all was David Ford, the youngest boss in the family's history, who'd taken power at 29 and held it with an iron grip ever since. The briefing included nothing personal about him, no mention of past relationships, no hints about his preferences or history. He was a ghost at the center of his own empire. Friday morning arrived gray and misty, Chicago's skyline disappearing into low-hanging clouds. Janet stood at her window holding her coffee, wearing one of the designer dresses David had sent, a simple day dress that probably cost more than her entire previous wardrobe. The town car arrived precisely at 8. David was in the back, reading something on a tablet, looking every inch the successful businessman in a charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He glanced up as she slid in beside him, and something flickered in his eyes. "You look appropriate," he said. "Such flattery. No wonder you needed to hire a date." This time he did smile just slightly. "Point taken. You look beautiful, Janet. The dress suits you. Your shopping assistant has good taste." "I picked it myself." That shut her up. The idea of David Ford browsing through women's clothing to choose something specifically for her was oddly intimate. The drive to the private airfield took 40 minutes. Janet had expected a commercial flight, first class maybe, but the sleek private jet waiting on the tarmac reminded her once again exactly who she was dealing with. "Yours?" she asked as they boarded. "The family's, though I use it most often." David guided her to a leather seat that was more comfortable than her couch. "The wedding's in the Hamptons. My family has a compound there." "Of course they do." As the plane lifted off, Chicago disappearing beneath them, David pulled out a ring box. "What's that?" Janet's heart skipped. "Credibility." He opened it, revealing a diamond ring that caught the morning light like captured fire. "No one will believe we're together if you're not wearing something significant." That must be worth." "Don't think about what it's worth. Think about what it represents." He took her left hand, his fingers warm against hers, and slid the ring into place. It fit perfectly, of course. "For the next 3 days, you're mine. That ring tells everyone to keep their distance." "And what tells them to keep their distance from you?" His smile was sharp as a blade. "I do." As they flew east toward whatever awaited them, Janet turned the ring on her finger, watching it sparkle. She'd made a deal with David Ford, stepped into his world of luxury and danger. But as she glanced at him, his profile sharp against the window, his hands steady on his tablet despite the turbulence, she wondered if she'd underestimated just how deep this rabbit hole went. The plane banked, turning toward the coast, and David reached over to take her hand. "Remember," he said quietly, "whatever happens, I protect what's mine." The possessive edge in his voice should have warned her off. Instead, Janet found herself squeezing his hand in return, the unfamiliar weight of the ring between them like a promise neither of them intended to keep. Or so they told themselves. The Ford compound materialized through the mist like something from a Gothic novel, sprawling Mediterranean-style villas connected by covered walkways, overlooking the gray Atlantic. As their car wound up the private drive, Janet counted at least a dozen other vehicles, each more expensive than the last. Men in dark suits stood at strategic points, their eyes tracking every movement. "Subtle," Janet murmured. "We don't do subtle," David replied, but his hand found hers, squeezing once. "Stay close to me. Don't wander off alone. If someone makes you uncomfortable, find me or Mark immediately." "You're making me nervous." "Good, nervous keeps you alert." The car stopped, and David's mask of controlled indifference slipped back into place. "Showtime." They'd barely stepped out when a woman's voice cut through the salt air. "David, you actually brought someone." Angela Davis descended the villa's front steps like a runway model. Her wedding weekend apparently beginning with a designer sundress and diamonds at noon. She was stunning in that polished way that spoke of personal trainers and perfect genetics, but her smile didn't reach her eyes as she assessed Janet. "Angela," David's greeting was cool as he kissed his cousin's cheek. "This is Janet Ruiz. Janet, my cousin, the bride." "Ruiz," Angela's perfectly shaped eyebrow arched. "That's not a family I'm familiar with." "Not everyone travels in our circles," David said smoothly, his hand settling possessively on Janet's lower back. "That's what makes her interesting." Angela's laugh tinkled like breaking glass. "How refreshing. Mother will be beside herself. She had money on you bringing that prosecutor. What was her name? Sandra something." "Sandra Moore, and she wasn't invited." Janet filed the name away, nodding the tension that flickered across David's jaw. Another piece of his carefully hidden history. "Well, come in. Everyone's dying to meet the woman who finally caught David Ford." Angela's smile turned predatory. "This should be entertaining." The interior of the villa was even more imposing than the exterior. Marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and artwork that belonged in museums. Voices echoed from various rooms, the compound already filling with wedding guests. David guided Janet through the maze with practiced ease, nodding to some people, deliberately avoiding others. They found Martha Blaker holding court in the conservatory, surrounded by a gaggle of women who fell silent the moment David entered. "Mother," he bent to kiss her cheek, and Janet saw real affection soften his features for just a moment. Martha Blaker was 70 but looked 50, with silver hair pulled into an elegant chignon and eyes the same dark shade as her son's. Those eyes fixed on Janet with laser intensity. "So you're the reason my son has been so secretive lately." Martha rose, circling Janet like a shark. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Janet asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Someone more ambitious. The women who usually pursue my son have agendas. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else." "Mother," David warned. It's refreshing, actually. Martha smiled, and it transformed her face. Come, sit with me. Tell me how you met my son. He's been remarkably close-lipped about it. David started to intervene, but Janet touched his arm. It's fine. Why don't you go do whatever business you need to do? I can handle girl talk. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or approval. Don't believe everything she tells you about me. Only the embarrassing parts, Martha promised, already linking her arm through Janet's. As David reluctantly left, Martha led Janet to a quiet corner, waving away the other women with imperial dismissal. Now then, Martha said, her voice dropping, tell me why you're really here. I'm David's date to the wedding. My dear, I've been navigating this world since before you were born. I know a business arrangement when I see one. The question is, what kind of business? Janet met her gaze steadily. The kind that's between David and me. Martha laughed, genuine this time. Oh, I like you. You've got spine. Most people fold under the famous Blaker stare. I've had a rough week. It takes more than a stare to intimidate me now. I imagine being with David is intimidating enough. Martha's expression grew serious. He's not an easy man to know. The position he holds, the things he's had to do to keep it. They've cost him, maybe more than even I realize. Why are you telling me this? Because in the 15 minutes since you arrived, I've seen my son look at you more times than he's looked at any woman in 5 years. And because Edwin Pointer has been watching you since you walked in. Janet's blood chilled. She followed Martha's subtle gesture to where Edwin Pointer stood by the windows, his pale eyes indeed fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 40, with the kind of lean build that suggested violence barely contained. He's been testing David's borders, Martha continued quietly, looking for weaknesses, and now you've walked in here, an unknown variable in a world that abhors surprises. I'm nobody. David just needed a date, yes, but he could have brought anyone. Models, actresses, daughters of allied families. Instead, he brought you. Martha patted Janet's hand, the massive diamonds on her fingers catching the light. That makes you somebody, whether you intended it or not. Before Janet could respond, a commotion from the foyer drew their attention. Raised voices, one of them David's, though she'd never heard him sound quite that dangerous. Excuse me, Martha said, rising gracefully. It seems the Petersons have arrived early. Janet followed her to find a tense standoff in the marble foyer. David stood facing a man who could only be John Peterson, older, heavier, with the satisfied look of someone who enjoyed his power too much. Behind him, Edwin Pointer had materialized like a shadow. Ford, Peterson was saying, his voice carrying deliberate insult in its casual tone. Heard you were bringing fresh meat to the party. David's stillness was more menacing than any threat. Choose your next words very carefully, John. Touchy must be serious if you're getting protective already. Peterson's eyes found Janet, scanning her with obvious dismissal. Though I can't see what all the fuss is about. She's pretty enough, but hardly worth. David moved so fast Janet barely saw it. One moment he was standing still, the next he had Peterson pressed against the marble column, his forearm across the older man's throat. Finish that sentence, David said quietly, and they'll be fishing pieces of you out of the Atlantic for weeks. David, Martha's voice cut through the tension like a blade. This is Angela's wedding weekend. Whatever business you have with Mr. Peterson can wait until Monday. For a moment, nobody moved. Then David stepped back, straightening his suit jacket as if nothing had happened. Peterson rubbed his throat, his face red with rage and embarrassment. This isn't over, Ford. No, David agreed, but it's postponed. Get out of my sight before I forget my manners entirely. Edwin Pointer guided his boss away, but not before catching Janet's eye. His smile was cold, promising nothing good. Well, Martha said brightly, as if violence hadn't just erupted in her foyer, who's ready for lunch? The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of introductions and thinly veiled interrogations. Janet met aunts and uncles, cousins and business associates, each one trying to figure out who she was and what she wanted. David stayed close, his hand often finding the small of her back or her elbow, subtle touches that staked his claim. But it was during the rehearsal dinner that things took a turn. The formal dining room could have seated 50, but tonight held only 20, the immediate family and closest associates. Janet found herself between David and Mark Webster, across from Edwin Pointer and a woman introduced as Brenda Dawson, apparently Peterson's latest companion. Brenda was everything Janet wasn't: blonde, surgically enhanced, and dripping in jewelry that screamed new money. She spent most of dinner trying to catch David's eye, her attempts growing more obvious with each glass of wine. "So, Janet," Edwin said suddenly, his voice cutting through other conversations, "what do you do?" "I'm between positions at the moment," Janet replied carefully. "Oh, what field?" "Accounting." Edwin smiled like he'd won something. "Accounting? How practical. Though I heard you had some trouble at your last firm. Something about Timothy Jerusai." The table went quiet. David's hand found Janet's under the table, a warning pressure. "I don't know what you heard," Janet said evenly, "but I prefer not to discuss former employers." "Very diplomatic, though Jerusai tells a different story, says you were let go for inappropriate behavior." "That's enough." David's voice was deadly quiet. "I'm just making conversation," Edwin said innocently. "After all, if she's going to be part of the family, we should know what we're getting into." "She's not going to be part of the family," Angela interjected with a laugh that sounded like breaking crystal. "This is David we're talking about. He doesn't do permanent." "Angela," Martha warned. "What? We all know his track record. Remember that prosecutor? What was her name? Sandra Moore. She lasted, 3 months before David got bored." Janet felt David tense beside her. Under the table, she did something that surprised them both. She took his hand properly, interlacing their fingers. "Actually," Janet said, her voice carrying more confidence than she felt, "David and I aren't concerned with track records. We're focusing on the present." "How zen," Brenda slurred, her fourth glass of wine evident in her voice. "But Edwin's right. You don't look like David's type at all." "And what exactly is David's type?" Janet asked. "Temporary," Edwin said with a cold smile. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. David started to rise, but Janet's grip on his hand tightened, keeping him in place. "You know what I find interesting?" Janet said conversationally. "How concerned everyone seems to be about David's relationships. It's almost like you're worried about something. Like maybe you're afraid that if he settles down, finds stability, he might become even more formidable than he already is." She smiled sweetly at Edwin. "But that's just the observation of a simple accountant. What do I know about family dynamics?" Mark cleared his throat, poorly disguising a laugh. Martha raised her wine glass slightly in Janet's direction, a subtle salute. Even Angela looked impressed despite herself. Edwin's face darkened. "You have no idea what you've walked into, little girl." "Edwin," David's voice carried lethal warning. "If you threaten her again, even by implication, I'll forget that we're at my mother's table." "Your mother's table in your family's house at your cousin's wedding." Edwin stood, straightening his jacket. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Ford. Things change, power shifts, even empires fall." He left with Brenda stumbling after him. The silence that followed was deafening. "Well," Martha said finally, "that was illuminating. Shall we have dessert?" Later, David walked Janet to her room. A luxurious suite with an ocean view that would have thrilled her under different circumstances. "You handled that well," he said, stopping at her doorway. "Edwin Pointer wants you dead," Janet said bluntly. "That wasn't subtle threat-making. He's planning something." "I know. And you brought me into the middle of it." David turned to face her fully, and in the hallway's soft lighting, she could see the weight he carried in the lines around his eyes, the tension in his shoulders. "I thought I was bringing you to a wedding, not a war," he admitted. "I'm sorry." "Are you? Or did you know exactly what you were doing? Bringing an outsider to shake things up, to make them all wonder what you were planning. His smile was rueful. You're smarter than you let on, Janet Ruiz. Accountants usually are. We see patterns other people miss. And what patterns do you see here? Janet considered the question, thinking about the day's interactions, the undercurrents she'd observed. Your family loves you but fears you. Your enemies respect you but want you gone. And you're tired of it all, aren't you? The constant vigilance, the games, the loneliness of being at the top. David stared at her for a long moment. You see too much. Occupational hazard. He reached out, his fingers ghosting over the ring on her left hand. This was supposed to be simple, a business arrangement, 3 days of pretense. It still is. Is it? His eyes met hers, dark and intense. Because when Edwin was threatening you, I wanted to kill him. That's not business, Janet. That's something else. Before she could respond, a scream echoed from somewhere in the compound. David immediately pushed Janet behind him, his hand going to the gun she hadn't realized he carried. Mark appeared at the end of the hallway, running. Boss, we have a problem. Someone attacked Brenda Dawson. She's unconscious, maybe dying. Where's Edwin? David demanded. Gone. His car left 10 minutes ago. David cursed under his breath. He's setting me up. Attack his woman at my family's compound, make it look like retaliation for dinner. The police are already on their way, Mark said grimly. David turned to Janet. Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Mark. This is about to get complicated. But as sirens wailed in the distance and family members began gathering in hushed, worried clusters, Janet realized it had always been complicated. She'd just been too naive to see it. From her window, she watched police cars stream up the drive, their lights painting the compound in reds and blues. David stood in the courtyard below, his posture relaxed as he spoke with detectives, but she could see the coiled tension in him, the predator calculating threats and responses. A soft knock at her door made her jump. It's Martha, came the voice. May I come in? Janet opened the door to find David's mother looking older than she had hours ago, the stress showing in the lines around her mouth. Is Brenda? Alive, barely. Someone hit her from behind, left her in the rose garden. Martha moved to the window, watching her son deal with the police. Edwin's claiming David ordered it as a warning. That's ridiculous. David was with me. For some of the evening, yes, but there was a window of time when he was dealing with security arrangements. Martha turned from the window, her dark eyes serious. Tell me truthfully, do you believe my son capable of ordering such an attack? Janet thought about the violence she'd seen simmer beneath David's controlled surface, the casual way he'd threatened Peterson, the gun he carried like other men carried wallets. I think he's capable of it, she said slowly, but I don't think he did it. It's too sloppy, too obvious. David's smarter than that. Martha smiled sadly. Yes, he is, which is why Edwin chose this particular play. Either David ordered it, making him reckless and violent, or he didn't, making him unable to control what happens under his own roof. Either way, he looks weak. There has to be something we can do. Martha's eyebrow arched. My dear, you've been here less than a day. This isn't your fight. Maybe not, but I'm here, and despite everything, I don't want to see David framed for something he didn't do. Martha studied her for a long moment. You're either very brave or very foolish. Probably both. Then you'll fit right in with this family. Martha moved toward the door, then paused. There's something you should know. The prosecutor David dated, Sandra Moore, she ended things when she realized what he was, what this life really meant. She couldn't handle the violence, the moral ambiguity, the constant danger. She tried to change him, to save him from himself. Why are you telling me this? Because you haven't tried to change him. You haven't judged him. You've just accepted him. That's rarer than you might think. Martha opened the door. Be careful, Janet. My son is already more invested in you than he should be for a 3-day arrangement. And in our world, caring about someone is the most dangerous thing you can do. Dawn came too soon, bringing with it the controlled chaos of a wedding day under siege. Police tape still cordoned off the rose garden, and unfamiliar faces, detectives and forensic teams, moved through the compound with professional indifference to the family's prestige. Janet found David on the terrace, still wearing yesterday's clothes, a cup of cold coffee forgotten in his hand as he stared out at the churning Atlantic. He looked exhausted, the careful mask he usually wore cracked enough to show the man beneath. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, joining him at the railing. "No, been dealing with lawyers, police, and damage control." He glanced at her, taking in the simple sundress she'd chosen from the wardrobe he'd provided. "You should have stayed in your room. It's not safe." "David," she interrupted him gently. "Stop trying to protect everyone. You look like you're about to collapse. Angela's wedding is in 6 hours. The police are threatening to shut it down. Edwin's spreading rumors that I've lost control, and someone tried to kill a woman under my family's roof." His knuckles whitened as he gripped the railing. "So forgive me if I'm not at my best." Janet made a decision that surprised them both. She stepped closer, her hand covering his on the railing. "What can I do to help?" He turned to look at her fully, confusion and something else flickering in his dark eyes. "Why would you want to help? This isn't your problem." "Maybe not, but I'm here, and despite everything, I don't believe you ordered that attack. So tell me what you need." For a moment, David's careful control slipped entirely. He looked young, vulnerable, and desperately tired. Then he straightened, the mask sliding back into place, but his hand turned under hers, fingers interlacing. "I need to find out who really attacked Brenda before the wedding. If I can't, Edwin will use it to challenge my position. There are already whispers that I'm unstable, that I'm letting emotions cloud my judgment." "What emotions?" Janet asked, though her heart rate quickened. His thumb traced over her knuckles, a surprisingly gentle gesture. "The ones I'm not supposed to have." Before she could respond, Mark appeared, his expression grim. "Boss, we have a problem. The security footage from last night, it's been wiped. Professionally." "Inside job," David said immediately. "Someone on our security team." "That's what I'm thinking, but there's more." Mark glanced at Janet, clearly debating whether to continue in front of her. "She stays," David said firmly. "What else?" "Sandra Moore is here. She just checked into the Hamptons Inn, and she's been asking questions about Miss Ruiz." Janet felt David go rigid beside her. "Sandra Moore, the prosecutor." "Ex-prosecutor," Mark corrected. "She left the DA's office 6 months ago. Now she works for Peterson." The implications hung heavy in the salt air. David's ex-girlfriend, now working for his enemy, showing up on his cousin's wedding day when he was vulnerable. "It's a setup," Janet said suddenly. "The attack on Brenda, Sandra showing up, they're connected. Edwin's playing multiple angles." David looked at her sharply. "Explain." "Think about it. Attack Brenda to make you look violent and unstable. Have Sandra show up too. What? Discredit me, make you emotional. Either way, you're distracted, off balance. And while you're dealing with personal drama, Edwin makes his move." "She's right," Mark said, respect coloring his tone. "It's exactly the kind of play Edwin would make." David's phone buzzed. He answered it, his expression darkening with each word. When he hung up, his face was carved from stone. "That was Mother. Sandra just arrived at the compound. She's claiming she has information about who really attacked Brenda, but she'll only talk to me. Alone." "It's a trap," Janet said immediately. "Of course it is, but I don't have a choice." He turned to Mark. "Double the security on Janet if anything happens to her." "Nothing will happen to me," Janet interrupted, "because I'm coming with you." "Absolutely not." "David, think. Sandra wants you alone and emotional. She's counting on your history to make you vulnerable. But if I'm there, as your current girlfriend, it changes the dynamic. She can't play the ex-lover card with me in the room." Mark nodded slowly. "She has a point, boss." David looked between them, clearly torn. Finally, he sighed. "Fine, but you stay behind me, and if things go bad, you run. Understood." They found Sandra Moore in the conservatory, where Janet had first met Martha the day before. She was exactly what Janet had expected. Tall, blonde, perfectly put together in a way that spoke of money and privilege. But there was something sharp in her green eyes, a calculating coldness that her beauty couldn't quite hide. "David," Sandra said, her voice like honey over broken glass. "You look tired." "Sandra, you have 30 seconds to tell me what you know before I have you removed." Sandra's gaze shifted to Janet, cataloging everything from her simple dress to the ring on her finger. "So this is the replacement. How quaint." 20 seconds, David said coldly. "Fine, all business as always." Sandra pulled out her phone, showing them a video. "This is from a traffic camera near the compound last night. Look at the timestamp." The grainy footage showed Edwin Pointer's car, but the timestamp was 30 minutes before the attack on Brenda, and Edwin was clearly visible in the driver's seat, alone. "He couldn't have attacked her," Sandra continued. "He was already gone, but someone wanted it to look like either he did it or you did it in retaliation." "Why are you showing me this?" David asked suspiciously. "Because Edwin Pointer is an idiot who thinks he can control me with a paycheck. But more importantly, because the real attacker is someone you trust. Someone with access to your security systems." "Who?" David's voice was deadly quiet. Sandra smiled, the expression not reaching her eyes. "That information comes with a price." "Name it." Her gaze flicked to Janet again. "Her, gone, out of your life, out of this compound today." Janet felt David's body coil with tension beside her, but before he could respond, she stepped forward. "No deal," Janet said calmly. Sandra's perfect eyebrows arched. "Excuse me, this isn't your negotiation." "Actually, it is. You're asking David to choose between solving this crisis and keeping his word to me. But you're missing something important." "And what's that?" Janet smiled. "I already know who attacked Brenda." The conservatory went silent. David turned to stare at her, as did Mark, who'd been guarding the door. "That's impossible," Sandra said, but uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "Is it? I'm an accountant, remember? I see patterns." Janet moved to the window, gesturing to the rose garden below. "The attack happened during a very specific window, after dinner, but before the police arrived. Only someone who knew the family's routines could have timed it so perfectly. Someone who knew exactly where the security cameras were and how to avoid them." She turned back to face them. But most importantly, someone who had a reason to destabilize both David and Edwin. Someone who benefits if they destroy each other. "You're reaching," Sandra said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Am I? Tell me, Sandra, why did you really leave the DA's office? Was it because you were tired of prosecution, or because someone made you a better offer? Someone who needed an inside person, someone who could get close to both the Ford and Peterson families." David's eyes narrowed. "Janet, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that Sandra didn't come here to help you or Edwin. She came here to finish what she started 6 months ago when she left your bed with all your pillow talk secrets." Sandra laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's ridiculous. You have no proof." "The video you just showed us," Janet interrupted. "How did you get it? Traffic cameras are controlled by the city, and their footage isn't available to civilians. Unless you still have connections in the DA's office, or unless you were already watching that road because you knew what was going to happen." Sandra's composure finally cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about." "But I do," another voice said from the doorway. Martha Blaker entered, flanked by 2 security guards Janet didn't recognize. "I've been listening to this fascinating conversation. You see, I never liked you, Sandra. Even when David was blind to your ambitions, I saw them clearly." "Martha," Sandra started. "Mrs. Blaker," Martha corrected coldly. "And you're going to tell us everything, or these nice gentlemen will escort you to a room where we can have a more intensive conversation." Sandra's face went pale. She knew enough about the Ford family to understand that wasn't an idle threat. "It was Timothy Jerusai," Sandra said quickly. "He hired me to get close to David again, to destabilize things before the wedding. The plan was to make both David and Edwin look weak, then Jerusai's father would make a move for territory while everyone was distracted." Janet's blood ran cold. Timothy Jarosai, but he works for a family that's supposedly allied with the Petersons, yes, David said, his voice deadly calm. But Timothy's ambitious. He wants to prove himself, move up faster than his father's connections allow. He knew about Janet, Sandra continued, apparently deciding confession was her best option. When she refused him at the firm, he had her investigated, found out she was desperate, figured David might use her. So he had me come here to cause chaos, make you question everything. And Brenda, David asked. Timothy hit her himself. He's been here since yesterday, posing as additional catering staff. Check the kitchen hires, you'll find him under an alias. Mark was already on his phone, barking orders. Within minutes, he nodded to David. Got him. He's in the kitchen now, helping with wedding prep. Bring him, David ordered. Quietly. We don't want to disturb Angela's day more than necessary. As Mark left, David turned to Sandra. You're done in Chicago, in New York, on the entire East Coast. If I see you again, if I hear you're within 500 miles of my family, you'll disappear. Understood. Sandra nodded, her face pale. Martha's guards escorted her out, and suddenly Janet found herself alone with David and his mother. Well, Martha said, looking at Janet with new appreciation. You're full of surprises, aren't you? I just paid attention, Janet said, though her hands were shaking now that the confrontation was over. The pieces were all there. David moved closer to her, his hand finding the small of her back. You could have been killed if you were wrong. But I wasn't wrong. No, he said softly, something unreadable in his eyes. You weren't. Martha cleared her throat. The wedding starts in 3 hours. I suggest we all get ready and pretend none of this happened. Angela deserves her perfect day. As she left, David turned to Janet fully, his hands framing her face. Why did you do that? Why risk yourself for my family's problems? Janet met his gaze steadily. Because despite everything, you're not what I expected, David Ford. You're not the monster everyone thinks you are. I'm not a good man either. Maybe not, but you're not alone anymore. He kissed her then, sudden and desperate, like a drowning man finding air. When they broke apart, both were breathless. The weekend's almost over, he said against her lips. Our deal can wait until after the wedding, Janet interrupted. Right now, we have to get Timothy Jarosai and make sure Angela gets her perfect day. 2 hours later, Janet stood in front of the mirror in her room, barely recognizing herself. The evening gown David had chosen was a deep midnight blue that made her skin glow, with a neckline that was elegant rather than revealing. Her hair was swept up, courtesy of the stylist Martha had sent, and the diamond ring on her finger caught the light with every movement. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. David stood in the hallway, devastating in his tuxedo, but his expression was tense. Timothy's been handled, he said quietly. Confessed everything. The police have him, and Edwin's been cleared of suspicion. He's actually grateful, if you can believe it. What about the wedding? Going ahead as planned. Angela doesn't know about any of it. Mother made sure of that. He paused, drinking in her appearance. You look appropriate, she teased, echoing his words from yesterday. Beautiful, dangerously beautiful. Dangerous. I'm an accountant from Chicago. No, David said, stepping into her room and closing the door behind him. You're the woman who just outmaneuvered a professional manipulator and solved a crime that could have destroyed my family. You're dangerous because you see things others miss. You're dangerous because you're not afraid of me. Should I be afraid of you? He moved closer, backing her against the vanity. Everyone else is. I'm not everyone else. No, he agreed, his hands settling on her waist. You're not. The chemistry between them was electric, undeniable. But before either could act on it, Mark's voice came through the door. Boss, it's time. The ceremony's starting. David stepped back, offering Janet his arm, ready to finish this charade. But as they walked toward the garden where the ceremony would take place, Janet wondered if it had ever really been a charade at all. The wedding venue was breathtaking. White chairs arranged on the manicured lawn facing the ocean, an archway of roses and baby's breath framing the altar. Hundreds of guests were already seated, the who's who of both legitimate society and the underground world that operated in its shadows. David led Janet to their seats in the second row, directly behind Martha. As they sat, Janet noticed Edwin Pointer across the aisle. He caught her eye and, surprisingly, nodded respectfully. Word of her confrontation with Sandra had clearly spread. "You've impressed them," David murmured in her ear. "That's not easy to do." "I had a good teacher," Janet replied, squeezing his hand. The music began, and Angela appeared at the end of the aisle, radiant in a dress that probably cost more than most people's houses. Her groom, someone Janet had been introduced to but couldn't quite remember, looked appropriately awestruck. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional, with vows that spoke of loyalty and protection, words that carried extra weight in their world. But Janet found herself watching David instead of the bride and groom. His expression was unguarded for once, showing a wistfulness she hadn't expected. "Do you want this?" she whispered. "Marriage, family, the whole thing." "I never thought I could have it," he admitted quietly. "This life, it's not conducive to happily ever after. Maybe you just haven't found the right person, someone who can handle your world without being consumed by it." He turned to look at her fully, ignoring the ceremony. "Janet." But whatever he was going to say was cut off by the sound of shattering glass. Then screams. Armed men poured into the garden from multiple directions, their faces covered by masks. Guests scattered, some running, others, those from the life, reaching for concealed weapons. "Down!" David shouted, pulling Janet behind an overturned table as gunfire erupted. Through the chaos, Janet heard someone yelling in Spanish. Her blood ran cold as she recognized the voice. It was her former supervisor from the accounting firm, the one who'd fired her. But what was he doing here? "Ruiz," the voice called out. "Janet Ruiz, we know you're here. Come out and no one else gets hurt." David's arms tightened around her. "You know them." "My old boss, but this doesn't make sense." "Unless Jerusai wasn't working alone," David said grimly. He pulled out his phone, sending a quick message. "Mark's getting Mother to safety. We need to move." "They want me, if I go." "Absolutely not." His voice was steel. "You're under my protection. That means something." More gunfire, closer now. David pulled his weapon, checking the clip with practiced efficiency. "When I tell you to run, you go straight for the house. Don't look back." "David." "Promise me." Before she could respond, Edwin Pointer appeared beside them, blood on his shirt but his eyes clear. "Ford, they've got the exits covered, but there's a boat at the private dock." David looked at his enemy, or former enemy, with surprise. "Why are you helping?" "Because that woman of yours saved my reputation today. I pay my debts." Edwin fired at someone Janet couldn't see. "Plus, enemy of my enemy and all that." "The dock's half a mile through the garden," David said. "Then we better move fast." Edwin grinned, wild and dangerous. "Like old times, Ford, before we were on opposite sides." David actually smiled. "Try to keep up, old man." They moved as a unit, David and Edwin providing cover while Janet ran between them. The beautiful garden became a war zone, roses trampled, the wedding arch aflame. But they kept moving, dodging between sculptures and fountains. They were almost to the dock when someone stepped out from behind the boathouse. Janet's former supervisor, still in his cheap suit, but now holding a gun that looked very expensive. "Miss Ruiz, you've caused us quite a bit of trouble." "I don't understand," Janet said. "You fired me. What more do you want?" "You were supposed to be desperate, supposed to disappear, but instead you show up here with him." He gestured at David with disgust. "Do you know what your boyfriend did? He destroyed everything. Timothy Jerusai's arrest has unraveled 3 years of planning." "Planning for what?" David demanded. The man smiled coldly. "To take over Chicago while the old families were distracted with weddings and alliances. But you had to interfere, had to protect her." "I'll always protect her," David said simply. "How touching." The man raised his gun toward Janet. Let's see if you can protect her from. The shot was impossibly loud, but it wasn't Janet who fell. David had moved faster than thought, putting himself between her and the bullet. He staggered, red blooming across his white shirt, but stayed on his feet long enough to put 2 bullets in the gunman's chest. David! Janet caught him as he fell, her hands immediately going to the wound in his side. No, no, no. Had to, he gasped. Couldn't lose you. Edwin was already on his phone, barking orders for medical help. In the distance, sirens wailed, the real police this time, not the Ford family's tame cops. You idiot, Janet sobbed, pressing her hands against the wound to slow the bleeding. We had a deal, 3 days. You can't die before the 3 days are up. David's hand found her face, smearing blood on her cheek. Best deal I ever made. Stop talking like you're dying. You're not dying, I forbid it. He actually laughed, though it turned into a cough. Bossy, I like that about you. Mark appeared with a medical team, and suddenly Janet was being pulled away as they worked on David. She stood there in her ruined gown, covered in his blood, watching them fight to save his life. Martha appeared beside her, equally disheveled but steady. He'll survive. He's too stubborn to die. He took a bullet for me. Of course he did. Martha's arm went around Janet's shoulders. That's what Ford men do for the women they love. We've only known each other 3 days. Sometimes, that's all it takes to recognize what matters. The next hours blurred together. The hospital, where David was rushed into surgery. The police statements, Edwin Pointer surprisingly backing up their version of events. Angela and her new husband, who'd somehow managed to get married during a gunfight and were determined to count it as the most memorable wedding ever. Janet sat in the hospital waiting room, still in her blood-stained gown because she refused to leave. Mark brought her coffee, Martha brought her a change of clothes she ignored, and Edwin, of all people, sat with her in silence for an hour before his own men called him away. He's tougher than he looks, Edwin said before leaving, and he's got something to live for now. Finally, after 6 hours, the surgeon emerged. He'll be fine. The bullet missed anything vital. He's asking for someone named Janet. She was moving before he finished speaking. David looked pale against the hospital sheets, but his eyes were clear when they found her. You stayed. You took a bullet for me. Least I could do was wait around to yell at you for it. Are you going to yell? Janet sat on the edge of his bed, careful of his bandages. No, I'm going to do this instead. She kissed him, soft and careful but full of promise. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide. The 3 days are up, he said quietly. Our deal needs to be renegotiated, Janet interrupted. I'm thinking something more long-term. I'm dangerous. My world is dangerous. I noticed. But here's the thing, David Ford, I'm apparently dangerous too. I took down a conspiracy, saved your reputation, and survived a gunfight in evening wear. I think I can handle you. My mother will try to plan our wedding before I'm even out of the hospital. We're not engaged. David reached for something on the bedside table, the ring she'd been wearing all weekend, somehow salvaged from the chaos. We could be. You're on morphine. This doesn't count as a real proposal. Then I'll ask again when I'm sober, and again after that until you say yes. Janet looked at this impossible man, Mafia Boss, wounded protector, the most dangerous thing that had ever happened to her. Ask me again in a month, she said. When you're healed, when things are settled, ask me then. And what will you say? She smiled, sliding the ring onto her right hand instead of her left. Guess you'll have to wait and see. 1 month later, Janet stood in her new office. She'd started her own accounting firm, with suspiciously good luck finding clients who paid on time and never caused problems. David claimed he had nothing to do with it, but his smile said otherwise. He appeared in her doorway at exactly 5 p.m., fully healed though he still moved carefully sometimes. In his hand was a small velvet box, different from the first one. Janet Ruiz, he said formally, going to one knee right there in her office. You walked into my life by accident and turned it completely upside down. You saved my family, my reputation, and most importantly, you saved me from a lifetime of loneliness I didn't even know I was facing. Will you marry me? For real this time, no deals, no arrangements, just us." Janet looked at the ring, simpler than the first one, but somehow more perfect. A single diamond surrounded by smaller stones, elegant and understated. "What does your mother think?" she asked. "She's already planning the wedding." "What does Edwin think?" "He's offered to be a groomsman, which is disturbing on multiple levels." "And what do you think?" David stood, moving closer. "I think I fell in love with you somewhere between you calling me out at dinner and taking a stand against Sandra. I think you're the bravest, smartest, most infuriating woman I've ever met. And I think if you don't say yes soon, I might actually pass out from nerves." The great David Ford, nervous. "Terrified," he admitted. "You have all the power here, Janet, you always have." She thought about the weekend that had changed everything, the danger, the drama, the absolute chaos of it all. Then she thought about the past month, David bringing her coffee every morning, introducing her to legitimate business contacts, being patient as she learned to navigate his complex world. "Yes," she said simply. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her like he'd been drowning for a month, and she was air. "No huge family wedding," Janet said against his lips. "I've seen how those go." "City Hall." "Perfect. My mother will kill us both. She'll get over it." They were married 2 weeks later, with only Mark and Martha as witnesses. But the reception, that was a different story. 300 guests, including a surprisingly jovial Edwin Pointer and a fully recovered Brenda Dawson, who'd left John Peterson for a nice orthodontist from Jersey. As David and Janet swayed to their first dance, he whispered in her ear, "You know that first day, when I found you in the rain? When you almost ran me over. I wasn't going to stop. Mark was driving and we were already late, but something made me look out the window and there you were, soaking wet, holding that eviction notice, looking like you were ready to fight the whole world. I was having a bad day. You were perfect, you are perfect. I'm an accountant who accidentally married into the mafia. You're the woman who brought down a conspiracy, united enemy families, and made me believe in something beyond business and blood." Janet pulled back to look at him. "What's that?" "Love, Janet. You made me believe in love." As they kissed, the room erupted in applause. Angela caught the bouquet with suspicious accuracy. Martha wiped away tears she'd deny later. And somewhere in Chicago, Timothy Jerusai sat in a federal prison, wondering how one accountant had brought down his entire operation. But Janet didn't think about any of that. She thought about the man in her arms, the ring on her finger, and the strange, violent, beautiful world she'd chosen to make her own. The Mafia Boss had needed a date for a family wedding. But no one, not David, not Janet, not anyone, had expected her to walk in as a stranger and leave as the woman who changed everything. Some deals, it turned out, were worth far more than their original terms. And some accidents were actually destiny, dressed up in rain and desperation, waiting for the right moment to transform two lives forever. 5 years later, Janet Ford stood in the same Hamptons garden where her life had changed, watching her 4-year-old daughter chase fireflies while David helped their 2-year-old son toddle through the grass. The compound had been rebuilt after that violent wedding, made safer, more secure. "Aunt Janet," Angela's oldest called out, "tell us the story again." "Which story?" Janet asked, though she knew. "The one about how you met Uncle David. The real story, not the one Grandma Martha tells." David appeared beside her, their son on his shoulders. "The real story, huh?" "Well," Janet said, settling onto the grass as children gathered around her, their own, Angela's, even Edwin Pointer's surprising brood. "It started with the worst day of my life. I'd lost my job, was about to lose my apartment, and then a car almost hit me in the rain." "But Uncle David saved you," Angela's daughter interrupted. "No," Janet corrected gently. "We saved each other." She looked up at her husband, who still wore designer suits but smiled more often now, who transformed the family business into something mostly legitimate, who came home every night to tuck their children into bed. Sometimes, Janet continued, the worst day of your life is actually the beginning of everything good. You just don't know it yet. That's too philosophical for kids, sweetheart, David said, sitting beside her. Then you tell it better. All right. Once upon a time, a very stubborn mafia boss needed a date to a wedding. And no one expected her to walk in with him, the children chorused, knowing this part by heart. But she did, David said, pulling Janet close, and nothing was ever the same again. As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Janet thought about that desperate girl in the rain, about the cold man in the perfect suit, about 3 days that became forever. Some stories, she realized, were too strange to be fiction.